Welcome to the Restoration Activation Project video commentary series. Hi, I'm Marianne and I'm glad you could join me. In this commentary, I'm going to be looking more deeply into the balancing process that's always going on throughout the whole of consciousness and how that relates directly to the conscious journey of awakening. But first, I'm going to do a little housekeeping. In the last commentary, I did a Q&A session and addressed a few questions. And one of those questions was, how do I know that I'm on a conscious journey of awakening? And I wanted to add a couple of possible means that might be indicators for you because they're really pretty potent. And I'll preface this by saying, as I did in the last video, there is no way that I could possibly address every potential, what might be a sign for you that you're on this journey and meant to be on this journey. So with that in mind, here's a couple of more potential signs for you. When you are doing this work, you're doing clearings, you're working to expand your higher order knowledge, you're tuning more and more into and aligning with core self and inner knowing. You're working through trying to learn various processes and so forth. You're doing the work. You're giving focused time and attention to progressing on this journey. And when you do that, you make definitive progress. Things happen pretty quickly for you. That's a great sign that you're meant to be on this journey. Things are flowing. When you do the work, you get results. Maybe not as dramatic as you'd like, and there's ways that you can sort of amp that up, but nevertheless, there is movement, okay? Forward movement, all right? And another indicator that you may well be meant to be, or that you're on this journey and may well be meant to be on this journey, is whenever you find yourself in circumstances or situations wherein you're not able, you're feeling so overwhelmed by life and various situations and events that you're unable, at least for the time being, to devote focused time and attention to this work, or you're around other people where it's just not feasible, whatever, but you feel deeply frustrated. You feel like everything is out of whack and just keeps getting more so because you're unable to do this work. That's a great indicator that you're meant to be on this journey. So there's two more signs that might be helpful for you in determining whether or not you're meant to be on this journey. And I also wanted to, one of the other questions I addressed was how to begin identifying and removing distortions, the false beliefs, ideas, notions, ideologies, dogmas that we carry within us, that have been entrained within us, that we've carried from one generation to the next perhaps, or just within this particular lifetime in this reality. But nevertheless, this accumulation that we all have gotten, those are distortions. And a distortion leads to, therefore, because it is a false belief, therefore it literally distorts not only your perception and understanding of things and limits it, which throws you into fear-based thoughts, emotions, and behaviors, it literally causes energetic bottlenecks and blockages in your body that prevent the highest capacity inflow of core self-will, core self's higher knowledge and capacities. Your own capacities to your intuitive capacities, whatever other inbuilt capacities you still have that may be dormant at this point, or even if some of them have become now activated, it limits them. These distortions limit them. So I addressed a couple of examples of how to start going about identifying and removing some of these blocks, these distortions. And the examples that I used were around distortions that were based in ego, identifications, and attachments. But I just want to make the point here now that these distortions can be associated with other workings. For example, inner child issues, core wounding issues, um, shadow issues, shadow projecting and things like that. So I just wanted to make it clear that they're not always directly, yeah, always indirectly, ego's involved, but they're not always purely ego identification and attachment issues. Okay? All right. Now let's get right into today's topic, which is digging a little more deeply so that you'll have a deeper understanding of the balancing process and why it's so important that you really begin putting information, running it past inner self and core self knowledge and attunement with that in this area, because this balancing process is the fundamental operation, function of consciousness. It is constantly, in every way imaginable and those that we can't imagine, seeking to balance itself between the two fundamental aspects of itself, its dual nature, made up of, comprising consciousness-progressive consciousness, sometimes referred to as service to others consciousness, or consciousness-regressive consciousness, which is often referred to by some as service to self-consciousness. Other references include positive, negative, light and dark, good and bad, good and evil. But those two fundamental characteristics of consciousness itself that come through all of its aspects, varying degrees, but those are the two fundamental characteristics of the whole of consciousness. And now the two core components of consciousness are potential and vital energy. But those two come together in all these different ranges and colors and shades of consciousness-progressive consciousness and consciousness-regressive consciousness. All right? So this balancing act is always going on in every area and aspect of consciousness. Zooming out, getting a really high perspective, this balancing process is going on throughout. Well, let's start with between. Consciousness comprises all these different realities and densities and dimensions, and along with that, evolutionary cycles that are affiliated with those realities and densities and dimensions. All right? So there is a balancing that's always going on between those expressions of consciousness. But not only between them, but within each of those expressions. So balancing of the greater between all the aspects, but then balancing within each aspect. Perhaps we'll take one reality, for example, that exists within a density and dimension that includes where timelines are a characteristic. Timelines do not exist in higher densities. Certainly not much higher densities, but typically they're restricted to the lower densities and dimensions, all right? But within, all these different timelines, between timelines, there's a balancing going on. Within timelines, there's a balancing going on. So this balancing process is pervasive, all right? So let's zoom in a little bit more from the zoomed out. We're zooming in. Those of us who have a core soul, not everyone does. Core self embodies all of the different versions of ourselves. And this balancing process is always going on between the different versions of ourselves, because remember, not every version of ourselves is in this reality. All right? Beyond that, remember I mentioned that not every reality is affiliated with timelines. There are many, 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 many. I would dare say most are not affiliated with timelines, because consciousness itself is timeless. And that doesn't necessarily mean that's not doesn't exactly equate to eternal, but the whole of consciousness, by and large, I would say the majority of it is timeless. Okay, but there's this balancing process, ultimately meaning that all versions of ourselves exist simultaneously. Because there really is no time. So this balancing process is going on between versions of ourselves and within each version of core self. All right? Zooming in a little more. What I mean by balancing going on within each version, there's a couple of levels of that. We each have there are different areas of our lives, different aspects of our lives, okay? We have perhaps our career or job or business or work aspect of our life. We have the personal aspect of our life, the recreational, the relationships. We also have business relationships. But all these different areas of our life, there's a balancing going on. And when we're not consciously a part of that, then that's when some rough spots can occur, okay? When we're out of balance between areas of our lives. In other words, if we're workaholics and we're letting our relationships and family ties or whatever fall by the wayside, that's an imbalance, okay? One way or the other, something will likely happen Sometimes it takes a big event, getting, hit over the head by a 2x4 to get our attention that we really need to address this imbalance. Okay? And then within a relationship, there can be imbalances. There are imbalances. It's a constant, ongoing process. Nothing in consciousness itself is not static, ever. It's dynamic. It's a constant whole movement comprising all the different movements going on within it. Okay, it's dynamic. I'll get more into that a little bit later, but okay, so between the various areas of our lives, balancing, and then within each area of our lives, this balancing process. Now, this also, drilling down a little bit more, zooming in even more, this balancing process is going on within ourselves and between the different aspects of ourselves. Our mental, emotional, heart center, our mind center, our creational center. All the different energy centers are always seeking to balance itself because they are expressions of consciousness. And either we're a conscious part of that or we're not. And when we aren't, we tend to be just sort of led along. And things can go awry because of external influences. When core self is not in the driver's seat, when ego is in the driver's seat, then things can get off balance. So between these different aspects of ourselves, the physical body is a very important aspect of that. When we perhaps we're diligently working with our energy centers, trying to seek balance and harmony and alignment there, but we're neglecting the physical body. Big imbalance, because this mind-body complex, there is so much intelligence. It is the source of our inner knowing. And yes, the mind-body complex comprises these energy centers, which are directly connected. It's all part of energy. But the physical body, in other words, if your diet is lousy, you're not doing any physical movement, you're not taking care of this amazing home for this amazing vessel, this transducing instrument for core self, then that's another big imbalance. And again, when the balance gets more and more apparent, more and more off, then that's when issues can arise. Physical issues, mental, emotional, all these issues can arise. And sometimes they don't appear to be connected, but they are. They are. So, okay. Every expression, whether it is an entity, a being, a force, a reality, every expression of consciousness comprises some measure of consciousness progressive and or consciousness regressive consciousness. Remember, that's what's always, consciousness is always seeking to find balance between this equilibrium. And it's an ongoing process. It's not something that, okay, this is all in balance now. got all the areas of my life, my body, my mind, my energies. It's an ongoing process, which means it's that you don't ever stop working with that, assuming you're on a conscious journey of awakening. That's just what it's an ongoing process. You never arrive. Things keep changing because there are influences, things going on within us, all this external, all these other aspects of consciousness that are constantly affecting the balance. And if you're not consciously participating in this balancing process, it's easy to see how quickly and sometimes very dramatically things can get off balance. And the more we can maintain that equilibrium, do our best, we get into a flow of it. We intuitively know when something's off balance, either within our own lives, or within our own mind-body complex, some area of our life. When we work with this consciously, get into a pattern, a routine of that, and just automatically knowing when something feels off, that's an imbalance. Now, the causes of these imbalances can be distortion that hasn't been fully released, and more often, or released at all, because you're not even aware that you have it. So distortions are the primary cause within us of the various imbalances that we experience on a day in, day out basis. That's the primary cause. And yes, sometimes there are external influences, such as entity or energy interference, different factors that can interfere with our balancing process and maintaining or getting off balance. The majority of the imbalances are due to distortions. Okay. Now, it is, I just cannot stress enough how important it is to start really taking in and it becoming second nature to you to consider the balancing process in everything you do. That's an underlying consideration before you make any decisions, before you, or as you're doing your awakening process work, your self-mastery work. That should be always running in the background of your understanding and approach to your work or your relationships or decisions in any area of your life about anything. This balancing process is always going on. What do I need to see in terms of balance? What is off balance within or around me, or both? To be able to sense, the more you tune in to the fact that this process is going on. In other words, that's one of your baseline understandings. It's just very deeply ingrained within you. Then it opens up your capacity to more wholly address circumstances and situations in your life and challenges. Just knowing that that's always going on and that is playing a role. And the more you have that baseline awareness in everything that you do and experience, the more higher order knowledge as to how you need to be in this and address it, whatever the situation or circumstance. But it opens you to deeper understandings of how to do your work, how to move through this process. Okay, it's just so critical. That's why I talk about it a lot. It can make a huge difference in the results of your awakening process work. It can completely alter a decision that, given a similar circumstance a few years ago, whether it's a big challenge or whatever that's come across your path, and you might now choose a completely different, much more consciousness progressive, forward moving response, even though the situation is very similar. One that will perhaps finally enable you to fully see and address, remove at the root level whatever distortion was around this type of situation for you, or distortions, plural, because sometimes and fairly often there are multiple distortions at work that are inhibiting us and limiting our capacity to work through things and move past things to a different state of consciousness. All right? Okay, so just really, set an intention every day that I will be more in tune with each day as to deeper understandings around the balancing process and how that relates to me and how I can make better, more consciousness progressive choices on my journey. Because remember, as part of this greater balancing process, we are now in a reality that is predominantly consciousness regressive. Those of us on this journey, our highest purpose in being here is to bring balance. And frankly, every entity, whether human, non-human, that exists in this reality is part of that process, whether they know it or not. So that's what everyone's always doing all the time. Some of them are aware of this aspect of consciousness. The higher density beings are typically all aware. Now, some of the higher density beings that are functioning, some of them, through primarily consciousness-regressive consciousness, they might be aware of the process, but they may or may not be consciously participating in it. But some of the more evolved, even consciousness regressive, higher density beings are aware of this process, and they don't always like it, but they stretch the boundaries of the principles of creation and some of the rules of engagement of reality, stretching the boundaries to accommodate their underlying drive to bring regressive consciousness to this reality. They know that's why they're here, and they are into it and working in that flow consciously. All right? So, those of us on the conscious journey of awakening, that is our purpose, higher purpose, and our unique purpose is to go about bringing balance through consciousness progressive creation in our own unique way or ways. That's how unique purpose unfolds. When you've got a good handle on what the overarching purpose for your existence in this reality, at this time, in this version of core self, then that enables the unfoldment of unique purpose. It opens the door to facilitate the unfoldment of unique purpose. Okay? When you're clear about why you're here, the overarching purpose, you go, wow, okay, that's it. I'm here to do that. Then it's just a matter of tuning into your various, looking back at your life and looking at your talents, your knowledge, your skill sets, coming to identify your core strengths, and then your core strengths, and using that information to pinpoint your core genius. And there's a nice article on my website all about that and how to begin that process of identifying it. But it is through awareness of each of those. You're still going about your life. You're doing the things that inner knowing draws you to. Be clear that it's not just an ego draw, an egoic pull. But tuning into that and then looking at yourself and all the experiences that you've had and how that all comes into play. And ultimately, it just happens. Your unique purpose simply unfolds. All right? Got a little off there, but it's tied in. So, to participate in this balancing process, knowing your overarching purpose is to create through progressive consciousness to the greatest extent you can in any given moment. And remember, consciousness, life is about moment to moment to moment. The perpetual now. We live in each now. That's where our creative capacities lie. But if we're living constantly in the past or looking in the future, then that creational power is colored, diminished, and colored by past, not influenced. You're limiting your capacity to create through the present moment because you're not present moment aware. That's one of the biggest ways we undermine our creational energies and our capacities. We aren't living in the now. Another, core practices of self-mastery is present moment awareness, mindfulness. There is a difference. And the practice of bear with me, something's interfering. Okay, there is a fantastic article on my site that will guide you through, get you started in becoming more present, moment aware, and more mindful. And I'll put a link to that at the bottom or below this video, because those are fundamental to the self-mastery process. And the third item that's addressed in that article is totally becoming the master or mistress of how you expend your energies, your energetic currencies of time and attention, to become very, very prudent about that. But anyway, I'll put a link to the article. But those three fundamental practices will all help you get into the self-mastery flow, into this balancing process with conscious awareness. Okay? That's vital of this. So now there are any number of, we can't even imagine, we'll never, certainly not this little expression. No one expression of consciousness understands fully the whole of consciousness and all its workings and all of its goings on. Now there are the higher density that you evolve through to getting to higher, the more you have, the more understandings you have about all the workings. But even at that, the highest density beings and energies, there is no one entity who understands it all. So, but that's okay. That's okay. Now, and you just need to know enough. That doesn't mean that you shut down and you stop seeking and expanding your capacity to take on higher knowledge. No, that never stops. But we have to learn to be at peace with not knowing. It's like, okay, this is something that would be beneficial, but I don't know yet. I'll know when I need to know. Keep tuning in to core self, inner knowing. And at some point, stuff will come to you. It always does. When you keep asking sincerely with that deep burning desire and commitment, and you're doing clearing work, all of these things come together. You get information. You gain access to, regain access to core self wisdom, its desires, its will for you in this version of itself, in this reality at this time. Okay? Stick-to-itiveness, self-discipline. So that's the other practice that's vitally important, is being very prudent about what you're investing in, what you're investing your focused attention and time in. The more you focus in this work and expanding and clearing and questioning and seeking help to help you do that if you need to. But the more time, the greater your results. Okay? So understanding, gaining ever deeper understandings of the balancing process can make a phenomenal difference in your progress on this journey. And one of the other understandings around this is that every aspect of consciousness is participating in this balancing process, whether the energy entity is aware of it or not. Okay? So let's look at this now in terms of the people in our lives, people as a whole, and how this all can work. Um, Consider perhaps you're on this journey, but you have a friend that's still in your life, that there's still a strong enough connection, or you haven't not been able to work through a distortion around this relationship. In either case, this person is still in your life, and you've had a disagreement, or you haven't, but suddenly one day this person says something to you that is just so out of character, your jaw drops. Balancing process. Where are you out of balance? How can you bring that back into balance? Something's pulling, something's pushing. And either it's this person or an external influence that's working through her. And I'm not, or him, and I'm not talking about anyone in particular in your life, but this is just an example. But there are so many influences, especially to those who are unaware of this balancing process and that are not on a conscious journey of awakening, seeking to become more and more aware of what's really going on, that they're easy targets for other forces and entities who, whether or not they're aware that they're participating, they may not be consciously participating in this balancing process, but they see an opportunity and they take it because they just are so consciousness regressive, either aware of that or not, but they just are that. And so they're opportunists. Now I'm going to take a moment here to relate a nugget, a wisdom nugget that I came across many years ago, and this is my own interpretation, translation, I should say. And I believe it originally was sourced in Zen Buddhism. This was where I came across it in some of my studies in that area, research and so forth. But it's the levels of knowledge. And knowledge in this sense, pertaining to this wisdom nugget, is higher order knowledge. Knowledge of what you really are, what's really going on around you, higher order knowledge about reality and consciousness and all that. Not just a factoid that you pick up in a textbook or something. Talking about higher order knowledge. Okay, that's the knowledge that it's referring to. And there's 4 levels of knowledge. The first level, you don't know, and you don't know that you don't know. First level. The second level of knowledge is you don't know, but you know that you don't know. Okay? The third level is you know, and you know that you know. Well, you would think that that's the highest possible level of knowledge, right? Well, it isn't. There's one more, the 4th level. And that is, you know, but you don't know that you know. And that might take a couple of minutes for some of you to work through that and go, ah. But what it really means is you just are. You are the perfect instrument for core self to be creating in this reality at this time. Doesn't mean that you don't ever have a thought. Doesn't mean you're mindless. But it's basically, the mind is a tool, and you just are. You're so in tune with inner knowing, core self knowing. You're so in the flow of that. It kind of is without thought. You just are. You act. I think in Hinduism is basically you're not the doer. You just are. And that's how a number of the regressive consciousness beings function. They just go with it. They're far more in tune than most people with core self, if they have a core self. Sometimes they're puppets. They're not even human, even though they're in a human body. Sometimes there is no core self involved. They're just basically they're puppets or some version of an android or whatever. There's all sorts of variations of that. I'll touch on that in a minute. But they're just, and if they don't have a core self, they're being used by another entity. It could be human or non-human, to function in a certain way to achieve that entity's agenda, to fulfill that entity's agenda through this puppet or android or whatever it is. Okay? But speaking specifically to others that have, or at least had, it may be dormant right now, or core self, some people call soul, may have temporarily left the body, but for whatever reason, they're not in touch with core self. They either don't seek to do that, or they've lost the capacity, or they never had it. But anyway, they're far more in tune with fulfilling their purpose in the balancing act. They're performing their role perfectly. And that isn't necessarily the case for most people who believe themselves to be on the conscious journey of awakening. And that's not a judgment. That's not a condemnation. This is just an observation to expand your understanding and your consciousness, and help you develop an ever-expanding, less limited view of reality. All this information is intended to help you expand, more closely attuned with core self and inner knowing, so that you can progress on your journey. And the more we understand, the more we take in that kind of knowledge, it's always empowering. It's always empowering. It's not about getting bogged down in the specific mechanics of consciousness and the balancing process, but being deeply attuned to the principle itself. And as I mentioned earlier, perhaps you are spending a lot of focus, time, and attention doing this work, but you're neglecting something else. Then it's going to impact the results of your efforts to do your awakening, self-mastery work. That's what imbalances do. They interfere. And it's nothing to flip out over. It's just getting attuned to that way of seeing things. It's the underlying understanding that, okay, something is off balance. Let's take it to another type of example wherein perhaps you've experienced recently what you know was some sort of entity interference, either through yourself or by way of another that you were interacting with. Okay? That's an indicator of an imbalance. Yes, there's likely some distortion within you related to that too, but distortions create imbalances because we're not fully attuned to core self. When we have distortions within us, it's not possible to fully transduce core self, which means there's an imbalance. Considering our purpose is to be aligned with core self, to bring consciousness, progressive consciousness. In other words, the way we create in this reality, into this reality, to help balance out the two fundamental aspects of consciousness. And so when there's imbalance within ourselves, it extremely inhibits, if not completely restricts, our ability to do that, to fulfill our mission, if you will, the assignment of this version of yourself. Okay? And I hope also, too, that the more information that I bring to you, and again, this information specifically for those who have a deep knowing that they're on this journey, so that you can progress on this journey. That's the bottom line. That's my ongoing intention. Awareness. Helping you expand your awareness to begin embodying more and more understandings of how things are working. And as important as it is to keep doing that, to constantly seek more in that sense, not the typical collective sense of more, but a deep thirst, a deep desire to keep stretching, pushing the limits of your current range of thoughts, your current range of behaviors, or to completely change that pattern. Because it is those very things as well. And I recently wrote and posted an article on my website that gets into how consistent ranges of thought, emotion, and behavior is what influences our DNA. It changes our genetic structure. And so if you can look across your life, and even if it's not been a primarily consciousness regressive life, seeking to find consistent ranges of thought, emotion, and behavior, consistency in every area of your life, that are consciousness progressive, consciousness driven, and to establish those. And more often than not, it involves a number of behavioral changes, in addition to clearing out belief systems and all that. But behavioral patterns, thought patterns, if your intention is to restore the original full human genetics that are still active within us. Not everyone, no, because as I mentioned earlier, not even everyone here is not even human, much less on a journey like this. I mean, so this is all about and directed toward, specifically towards people who know they're on this journey and that they're here to bring balance in that way. Consciousness, progressive creation. All right. Now, I've touched on a little bit, but I'm going to get a little more, well, actually, you know what? I think this is a good place to call it a wrap. I'm going to pick up on this in my next commentary, and I'm going to be getting a little more into interference and interventions as they relate to the balancing process. Okay? Remember, interventions are signs, messages, and so forth from consciousness progressive higher density beings, entities, and interference is things that mess with your attempts to bring consciousness progressive consciousness and creation into this reality. So those are higher density beings as well, but they're functioning primarily through consciousness, regressive consciousness, okay? So intervention, interference. And I'll get into that more deeply in terms of the balancing process and the conscious journey of awakening in the upcoming commentary, all right? So stay tuned for that. And if you're finding this information to be of benefit, and you haven't already done so, I invite you to subscribe. And the best place to do that is on my website, because when you subscribe on my website, then you get notified not only of the video commentaries, but of any articles and new resources that are being put on the website on an ongoing basis. So I invite you to do that. Until we connect next time, I wish you well on your journey. Take care.